up for, it looks like a transcription. So if you need that closed caption or that transcription, you should be able to see this when you're viewing at a later date. That should be there in the chat bar. So please look for that if you need that. So the way I'm going to get started, as usual, I'll share my presentation. As a teacher, I should be used to this now, but it does take me a little while to find my way over. And I want to introduce our Lunchbox series again. This is the third speaker we've had this semester. We're going to continue this into the foreseeable future. I see my date is incorrect already over there, so I'll have to fix that. This is the third, not the second. And today we have a great speaker that's been a colleague and a friend of mine for a long time. Here's our schedule of what's upcoming in the near future and what we've had in the past. Today, again, February 17th. Damon Seawright from Americulture. I would say every one of my students is very familiar with the company Americulture. You've had time and you've pursued the website. You know about the genetic lines of these fish more than most people in the industry even. I think when tilapia growers, in my opinion, get into the industry, currently they're bombarded with the internet, and first thing you may find on a tilapia source may come off of Amazon or one of these kind of common third-party vendors. That's really just moving fish around, and the genetic line is not that important to some of those vendors. Then there's also legalities that we need to talk about, and I'm sure Damon will talk about how since SFCC has been in operation, just of those very few short years, we've seen a change on the state level where tilapia is now allowed to be cultured in New Mexico. For a long time, when I knew Damon Seawright before I came to New Mexico, I would assume he was the only grower of tilapia because he was a breeder, and he's worked that out, and he'll talk about that kind of trajectory of his career today. Next month, we're going to take a break for midterms. We're going to take a break for spring break. And coming up at the end of March, Dr. James Tidwell from Kentucky State, and he's going to talk about the aquaculture program there. You can see this semester, I would say it's really heavy on the aquaculture side, and we'll continue to get more hydroponic players in here. We had one that canceled out last week because of all the snow, and they had to go skiing instead of do the presentation. Now, they were totally willing to do the presentation from the top of the ski mountain, but we got Pedro to fill in, and it was a great time to get Pedro, who is our tech, to talk a lot about his career. And so our students could relate more. And then you see what's coming up in the future. Rosanna Salanave is a partner of mine, and she's involved with some of the permitting, or at least sometimes pushing the fish farmers to make sure that they get their papers in. But her real position is a aquatic ecology extension specialist. And I've asked her to speak on that career path as well, which I think is a great career if you're interested in aquaculture and water resources and hydroponics. You'll be able to teach others how to kind of improve the production and be more sustainable. And finally, Justin Henry, another aquaculture guru in Canada, and he's going to talk about his aquaponic cannabis business, but he'll talk about organic certification. He'll talk about the sturgeon and caviar business as well. Okay, and then I do want to keep up to date with some of these upcoming events. Some of these I've been mentioning now. Indoor AgCon, National Growers Association. So if you're an indoor grower, hydroponic grower, every vendor is going to be at a conference like this. I would imagine this is 15,000 people minimum. Even coming back from COVID, they're going to put 15,000 people together for these conferences. And the trade show is where a lot of this really happens.
I'm the presenter. I just go help them. They don't have water to the blue tanks. She probably didn't turn off the water.
I'm going to have to put Damon, I got to put you on mute, Damon. Are you good? Cool. He's got it. A couple other meetings, very important, coming up. The next one is Aquaculture America in early March. So I'll be attending that and presenting on our program and on our students. So it's always an honor to present on you all. We do amazing work. I'll bring in this whole food, energy, water nexus and how we're kind of addressing all those, not just in CEA, but in the sustainability area. And then another one that's come up recently that in my wheelhouse and what I want to spread is this next one, the Greenhouse Crop Production and Engineering Design Short Course. This is an intensive 3-day course with the experts in controlled environment agriculture, from lighting to greenhouse management to hydroponics. There's a little bit of aquaponics involved. Our friend Eric Highfield, who started this program, will be presenting on automation in controlled environments. It's a 3-day intensive, and there is definitely a cost to that. So if you want information, I've put that for students in our Teams group, where you even get a discount for that. So let me know if you plan to attend that. The only caveat here, the only conflict that I see is a major conflict. It's your midterm week. Okay, so I understand if you can't take advantage of this, but start looking at that CEAC, University of Arizona short course website, and you'll see other offerings. And I'll talk to you about their tomato production course later this semester when we get into commercial tomato production. Cultivate is another big indoor grow out in Ohio. You can see the dates there. The NSERA is a USDA committee that's talks about controlled environment agriculture. So that's another one that's on my radar. And of course, the Aquaponic Association. So we always participate in that. But I don't want to go too much longer without introducing our speaker. So now if you have a lunch, feel free, open your lunchbox. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to briefly introduce Damon Seawright. Again, Damon Seawright has been a colleague of mine for quite a while, but I can say the best way to introduce him to you is let you know that he's a mutual friend of the great Jim Riccossi. And we all know Jim Riccossi as the godfather of aquaponics, and Damon has been in aquaponics as long as Jim Riccossi, I believe, in some capacities. And Damon, I just want to lead in what we talk a lot about right now in our aquaponic class is what is aquaponics. And we understand it's a combination of microbial ecosystem with conventional aquaculture and hydroponics. But what Wilson Leonard really focuses on is we need to qualify it by how much of the nutrients come from the fish feed. And I just wanted to put that out there because Damon's worked a lot with fish feeds, fish genetics. He's got a lot to offer us as New Mexicans. So if you want a little more introduction, I can connect you afterwards as well. Damon, thank you so much for being here. I'll just go off screen and we'll watch our time and we'll try to cut it about 11:50, okay?
Sounds good. Hey, so sorry about the hot mic event there. That was real life fish farming here. I'm actually at my house. I'm 800 feet from the farm, and that's what fish farming life looks like.
That's exactly what I heard. I heard the emergencies and yelling out a demand to somebody, and I'll be there in 50 minutes.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, this is just it's just something that's going on, and they're grading fish, and there's this little thing that ordinarily I'd take care of, but I'm here, glad to be.
Thanks for your time.
But that's an insight to what the aquaculture life is like, which I'll talk about later. But yeah, I'm Damon Seawright, Americulture. I'm a longtime fish culturist. I decided to be a fish farmer when I was 8 years old. It all started in my dad was a researcher in Iowa at the Ames Laboratory in Iowa. And he became very interested in infectious diseases. And he was a veterinary virologist by trade. And he bought a book on aquaculture because he figured as the aquaculture intensified, it went from typically what you see in a pond arrangement to more intensive type farming indoors in intensive systems, that disease was going to be a big issue. And so he had a natural interest in this. And then he took me to the movie Jaws in 1975. I was 6 years old, and when I watched that movie, I absolutely fell in love with the oceans, and decided I was going to be a marine biologist. And that was really my life's focus for the next 2 years. And then at that time, my dad gave me probably the best advice he ever gave. He said, well, you have there are two lifestyles. There's two forms of marine biology. There's the established one, which is academically focused, where you live on grant money, oftentimes living on a boat away from your family, away from your kids if you're lucky enough to have them. And he said there's an emerging form of marine biology. It's the business form. It's called aquaculture. It's been around for a long time, but he thought it would be a critical emerging form of agriculture, and he was right. And he gave me a book. I was 8 years old. Gave me this book. It's Bartick's book entitled Aquaculture, and I actually started reading that thing when I was 8. And I decided in the middle of an Iowa cornfield I was going to be a fish farmer. And so I was crazy about fish, had 12 aquariums in my room when I was in elementary school and junior high school. And of course, every high school teacher I had, the only term papers I ever had dealt with the subject of aquaculture. And then it came time to actually become trained in this area collegiately. And so the best university at the time, back in 1987, was the University of Washington up in Seattle. They had a very broad-based experience, salmonid, with a salmonid emphasis, but really no one was working on tilapia at the time. Tilapia was largely unknown except in the developing world. And so, but I went off to the University of Washington, which had very good, the father of fish nutrition. This is George Halver was there, one of the foremost thinkers in genetics was there, Bill Hirschberger. They had a wide variety of excellent practitioners in the field of aquaculture. And so that's where I decided to go. And at that time, as a point of reference, 12% of the world's fish were grown on farms. Today, it's 53%. By 2050, it'll be at least 80%, and that's if nothing happens to the oceans. And I think we all know that's something's going to happen to the oceans. And so I started school, went through the basic core courses in aquaculture, and yet had really never, had not yet decided a career path. I thought it was time to really start refining what exactly I was going to do in life. And to achieve that, in the summer after my junior year, I went off to Hawaii. I had one of my dad's closest friends from vet school was a professor there at the University of Hawaii, and I worked with him in arranging a couple jobs at various fish farms on the island of Oahu. And so I went over there with a backpack, my computer, my scuba tank, my scuba bag, and I decided to just go farm to farm and volunteer throughout the summer, and it worked very well. I worked at a number of facilities. I worked at with 27 different species over that summer, and it was very, very clear to me at the end of that summer that tilapia was going to be the focus of my life, professional career at least. And so, and the reason that was, I took a very empirical, kind of cold-hearted look at what makes a good aquaculture species a good aquaculture species. And you have to have very rapid growth. It has to be disease resistant. It has to tolerate crowding, which is inevitable in aquaculture. You have to have a closed life cycle. So you have to be able to produce unlimited numbers of young on demand. And you have to be able to do so cost effectively. If that fish is vegetarian or has vegetarian leanings, that's even more fitting because of the cost, the impacts on diet cost. And most importantly, it has to be marketable. Now, at the time, there wasn't a big market for tilapia. Tilapia was not introduced in large scale to the U.S. marketplace until about 1993. But the way I looked at it as a 21-year-old was, what do Americans want? You know, Americans really don't like fish. They don't like the way it looks, smell. They don't like the way it tastes, but they like the health benefits of fish. And so I said, what fish really fits that bill? And I said, well, tilapia is it. It's mild flavored. It cooks up white. It doesn't smell. I said that combined with looking at this basic scorecard, which is, you know, its life cycle was closed. You could produce unlimited quantities of young. It was very disease resistant. It ate vegetable-based diets. I said tilapia was just for me, it was a mathematical certainty that tilapia was going to be a preeminent fish. I thought the #1 aquaculture species in the United States. And I would have been right if not for some reputational hitches that were attached to Chinese tilapia along the way. But tilapia at the time wasn't even on the radar of the U.S. market. It entered the market in 1993. It was 13th at that time. It broke into the top 10 in 2000, and it rests at #4 today, which is probably where it'll be for a while. And that's not aquaculture species. That's just fish species. That's any aquatic animal. That's shrimp, tuna, salmon, and then tilapia. So now I decided what species I was going to grow, I went back to school with that emphasis in mind. I was interested in aquaponics, and Jim Mercosi and Charlie were working at UVI at the time. They had a very creative way of achieving nutrient stability in these systems. And you guys are, I'm sure, familiar with this, the alternation of base types in addition to iron, and they achieved steady state conditions in an aquaponic environment. And I got married in 1991, and I had a dream early on in my marriage. About 5:30 in the morning, I popped out of bed and I had a dream. I said, I know how to solve this. It's a mass balance problem. And I said, there may be another way of achieving dynamic stability in nutrient concentrations other than adding nutrients. Fish, I realized, they're a homeostatic organism, which means they're quite good at maintaining internal biochemistry with a wide variety of diets. In other words, they can absorb and retain what they need, and they can dispel what they don't need very efficiently, either in the feces, in urine, in branchial waste. And I said, well, that's a simple mass balance problem. So you've got to figure out what the dynamics for each of these nutrients are, what percentage of these nutrients are retained by the fish, what nutrients are dispelled, and how are they dispelled, and what proportions, and are there any interactions between these nutrients either while they're inside the fish or in the waste stream. And so I developed what was called a designer diet concept. I said, well, if it's a mass balance issue, if you take the nutrient that typically accumulates at the fastest rate, which is almost always nitrogen, theoretically all the other nutrients will accumulate at a lesser rate because they're in lesser abundance than nitrogen. And so the theory is that you could supplement those diets with a calculated amount of the lesser nutrients to achieve dynamic equilibrium for those as well. And it actually worked quite well. And I went on because I actually couldn't find any grant support to support this research. I paid for it myself. Because I paid for it myself, there was a loophole in the patent rules at the University of Washington, and I was able to own the patent. So I patented it. Patents expired by now. But anyway, the concept of using a diet to control the nutrient concentrations in the diet was a valid one. And it's one we planned on using commercially, have yet to do so to date. But I'm going to fast forward now from that point. I was very interested in getting into the aquaculture business. And I'd chosen a species. I had, of course, a real interest in aquaponics. But the next decision was deciding on a site. And since we were growing tilapia, we had to take a real look at what our plans were to get into large-scale tilapia production, not just hatchery. We're still a hatchery producer 27 years later now, and we're good at what we do. But our original plan was to get into large-scale commercial tilapia production. And we realized that at least our competitors would be mostly in the Western Hemisphere, because production in the Western Hemisphere is where fresh product is going to come from. And most of the producers in the Western Hemisphere have free heat. They operate in tropical, subtropical regions. And so we had to neutralize that competitive advantage. And the way to do that was to find a source of inexpensive heat, whether waste heat or geothermal energy. And I grew up in New Mexico. I graduated when I was 17 from high school in northern New Mexico. So New Mexico was home. We hired a consultant, and we gave him various specifications that we were interested in for a geothermal resource. We didn't want the water to be too deep for the sake of pumping costs. We wanted it to be quite hot, so it had very high BTU content. We wanted that water to be free of scaling. We wanted it to be very high quality, potable if possible. And we developed a matrix. We looked at various sites, and it actually boiled down to 2 New Mexico sites. One was Radium Springs, New Mexico, which is to the north of Las Cruces, and one was the Lightning Dock geothermal resource in Animas, New Mexico. And we actually were leaning for the Radium Springs because of its proximity to Las Cruces. I mean, my wife, I was newly married. She was pregnant. She'd never been away from the big city, never been away from her mom. And I wanted our marriage to survive. So being close to Las Cruces, I was thinking, yeah, that's probably a good idea. I'm not sure I should drag her out to Animas, which is truly the end of the road. And then I realized that the name Radium Springs would go on to haunt us one day. You would never be able to sell a fish if your mailing address was Radium Springs. And so we actually struck that off for that reason. Ended up in Animas, New Mexico. Glad we did. Our resource is, I don't use the word unique often because it means there's just one, but our resource really is unique. It is very shallow, 70 feet. The temperature is 232 Fahrenheit. It's not pressurized, right? You do have to pump it, and it's side by side with cold water. So it's like getting your bathtub to the right temperature. You just blend hot and cold water. And it comes at a cost, though. Like I said, we're out, you can't see the end. We're not at the end of the earth, but you can see it from here. But we really did, despite the fact that we're very isolated, which is a kind of a social limitation, everything else about this site was perfect for us. It had rail access, interstate access. It was really like a hub and spoke with regard to target markets that we would pursue with our adult fish products. The land was inexpensive. The geothermal resource was unmatched in our regard, in our assessment. And we had, other than Yuma, Arizona, we had the second highest level of solar sunlight of any place in the United States. And we thought, well, when we get into aquaponics, that's going to play a very important role. And so we decided on this site, but we were still 2 years out from being able to acquire any property here, and that was an issue that Charlie raised early on, and that was New Mexico. I remember these are, I'm just going to give you my histories here so you can kind of see the sort of things you run into. So back in this was 1994, we sat down with the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish, and we indicated an interest in bringing tilapia to the state, and they just said absolutely not. And so rather than just take that no and as an absolute no, what we did is we developed a proposal based on surface temperature data of every body of water in New Mexico, and we looked at about 20 sites in New Mexico and got the USGS surface water temperature data for the last 25 years, compiled it, came back to the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish and told them there isn't a body of water in New Mexico that at any time in the last 25 years could have supported a temperature sufficient for reproduction in tilapia. All right, I thought we had them for sure. And I said, besides, every state around New Mexico, whether it's Colorado, Nevada, Arizona, Texas, Oklahoma, even Mexico, they all permit tilapia. And I thought, that was a great argument. It was a terrible argument. The head guy replied, "We're quite proud of that fact." So anyway, we persisted, and over the course of time, we did finally, after 2 years, get a permit to bring tilapia to New Mexico. So we did kind of break that open. Legislatively, it's much easier now, but back in the old days, in the formative days, 93, 94, it was hardly workable. So with a permit to grow tilapia in hand, and we had fish that I had acquired, our initial strain, which is not the strain we rely on today, through academic channels while I was a grad student. We needed to start to get into business. And the capital, my dad was he moved out of veterinary virology into the private sector. He actually developed the RFID industry in the 1980s in a New Mexico company called Amtech. It's the global leader in RFID today. And as a result of that, he had some financial resources. He was retired at the time. He retired from that company and was very interested in getting back into a business. He said, why not do it here with me, join my son? And so that's where our investment capital came from. And that's one of the biggest constraints, that when you get into aquaculture, you'll see that whether you're part of a team that's raising money, whether you're an entrepreneur that's a startup, it's a real challenge. And probably my dad always said that raising money is the single most difficult thing in business. And after 27 years in this business, I would certainly concur. So we got into business, and it's all about cash flow. in business, particularly in farming. And so the quickest way to cash flow for us, even though we had aspirations to getting into large-scale adult tilapia production, was fingerling production. What we had was a disease-free strain of tilapia that was high performance. We're out in the middle of nowhere using groundwater. So not only were we disease-free, but we could keep it that way through strict biosecurity and isolation. You eliminate 99.9% of your risk if you prevent infected fish, water, or personnel from coming on your facility. So we just operated a closed facility for years and years and years and got into the fingerling business, which means you can sell product from the time you start within it takes about 30 days to have a saleable product. And so that's what we did. I was forewarned by one of our business advisors at the time. He said, Damon, be on the watch for management traps, is what he called it. Getting so busy in something that you can't do what you're intending on doing. And that's exactly what I did with my life. I got so busy. This hatchery business is a 70+ hour work week lifestyle, and has been for the entirety of the time that I've been here. If not for my love for aquaculture, I probably would have washed out a long time ago. And so, but we continued in this hatchery business, became a foremost producer. And then there was a disease called Streptococcus inea, and it was introduced by a hatchery down in Texas, Sweetwater, Texas. The Streptococcus inea actually came from sea bream, and the Israelis cultivate sea bream in net pens in the Red Sea. And there are a number of salt-tolerant tilapia strains that are also grown in ocean water. And what had happened is that a red strain of tilapia was co-cultivated side by side in net pens with sea bream. They contracted Streptococcus inea, which was a novel disease for North America. And then the founder of this hatchery down in Sweetwater, Texas, imported those fish into the United States. This is before we came into business, a couple of years before we started. And they were a hatchery, and there were very few hatcheries in the United States. And so what they did is they would go farm to farm, dropping off these infected fingerlings and seeding, like Johnny Appleseed, just seeding the United States with this disease, Streptococcus inea. Now our fish were disease-free, but that's actually a disadvantage it was a disadvantage in the formative years of the tilapia industry, because our fish were also immunologically naive. So when you're not exposed to a disease, you don't develop resistance to that disease. And so what ended up happening, we almost went out of business in like 1997, 1998 timeframe, because people just couldn't buy our fish, because I would say at least half or more of all the tilapia produced in the United States had Streptococcus inea. And so what happened, we began collaborating with a facility up in Canada, and this is Gary Chapman, is a close colleague of mine. He started a company, North American Tilapia Incorporated, and he sent a contingent to Africa, to Lake Nasser, to collect what I believe to be the finest collection of tilapia genetics from the wild that's ever taken place. They actually collected 1,000 females from throughout Lake Nasser, which is behind Aswan Dam. And the strain of tilapia there, it's a strain of Nile tilapia. It was distantly related to the strain we already had, but because of the natural selection conditions that exist in a water impoundment behind a dam, which is, it's going to be cooler water. It's upstream of the Nile Delta, which our original strain came from, so the water's cooler, the water's deeper. In a lake environment, the competitive selection pressure on males is different. Bigger is better. And what ended up happening is that this Nasser strain began to drift genetically and became a much faster growing Nile tilapia that grew to large size at lower temperatures and grew very, very, very large. Now our original strain, we had like a 12-pound specimen. I had some pictures here. I don't know how to share them, but we've had the world record is 12.7 pounds. We have a 15.8 pounder in our freezer, to give you an idea. It's 27 inches long. Well, Gary hired Douglas Tave out of Auburn University to go to Lake Nasser and collect these fish, bring them back to Canada, where he conducted a family-based selection program for many, many years. That program, we now house that program here. And so getting back to this time period where we were having a very difficult time selling fish because of disease, so purely out of an act of desperation, we said, I wonder if any hybrid vigor exists if we cross Gary's strain to our strain. And again, we were about to close down. And so we did that. We produced our first batches of fingerlings as a parting goodbye to Animas, New Mexico. We might as well say we tried it. Well, the experiment worked. And to give you some data, so what I'll give you one farm up in Idaho. We would send, of the fish we would send, about 30% of those fish would die within the first 2 months by the time they were 30 grams in size due to strep. And the remaining 70% had subclinical infection, which means that while they don't die, they're kind of sort of sick. So they don't grow well, they don't eat well, they don't perform well, they grow very variably. So we tried we did our last pure line sale to them, and then the next batch was this hybrid that we crossed between the strain, the Nasser strain, and our original Nile Delta strain. And the survival was 99.7% to 30 grams. So it went from 70% to 99.7%. So we were on to something. And so we called that our hybrid. And we basically stopped selling the pure line. We only sold the hybrid. And I think all of you up there have probably seen our lighter colored fish. Charlie, I assume that we've sent some of those over the course of the various years we've sent fish up there.
Sure.
So that fish is a very unusual fish. So in the formative years of our business here, we would see a mutation pop up in 1 in every 3 million fish, literally 1 in 3 million. And so over the first several years of our production, we came up with 6 of those fish that looked like that. And then they vanished. We never had a naturally produced one ever again. And what we did is we took one of those, bred them out to 6 different groups of females, all genetically unrelated to one another, and then intercrossed those, and we came up with this, what we call this pearl, desert pearl. And there's a reason it's in 1 in 3 million. It's because it doesn't survive in the wild. You can imagine being a light-colored fish in the Nile River, you're going to get picked off immediately. So there's a lot of pressure against prevalence of that color. But we wanted something distinct in the U.S. marketplace and the Canadian marketplace, and we knew that our ultimate target of our customers of our fingerlings were Asian buyers, and Asian buyers have, in some cases, a preference for unique or kind of reddish, orangish fish, and so we began to develop that as well, side by side. And so our business has one of the challenges in as I saw Charlie's list of various speakers, you're getting a nice sampling of people all around the industry, and some of you may end up in the academic world, some in a startup environment, some with established fish farms, either in professional leadership or as staffers. And I'm glad you're getting a wide exposure. I'm exposing you to just the realities of business, but from a hatchery perspective. So, people oftentimes think that the hatchery, we get paid first, and it's kind of a nice place on the spectrum, and it's really not so much so. It's very, very difficult. Everything backs up to us. I'll give you a near-term real example, and this is COVID. So when COVID hit, what happened is there were the restaurant restrictions, and as well as the grocery store restrictions, and just human psychology and its impact on wanting to go to the store altered the buying behavior of the target market of our customers, so that the sales volume of live tilapia went down 65% in 1 year. And that, you can imagine, so all of our customers then got backed up. Their tanks were full. They couldn't sell their fish. Since they couldn't sell their fish, they didn't have empty tanks for our fish, which backed up to us. And it has been really, really tough. 2021 was really brutal. We're starting to see a rebound here. But, one of the this is Americulture is a critical component of the supply chain in the United States tilapia market. There's really only 3 hatcheries in the United States. 2 are in Florida, and there's us. And if something happens to us, then it will have a massive ripple effect throughout the industry. Our competition in Florida, which is really not really that competitive, they sell primarily to Florida producers, and which they have a natural cost advantage because they don't need to air freight. They can just truck fingerlings right to the production facilities. But they suffer from hurricanes. The reports a month ago, and all the iguanas were falling out of the trees, frozen in Florida. Well, that means that these tilapia producers couldn't breed. And when we developed here, consistent with my original criterion for what makes a good aquaculture species, you want a fish that's easy to grow, but you also need to be able to reproduce that fish year round. And that was one of the things that the geothermal energy allowed us to do. And we developed a technology for breeding that really sets us apart. It is a trade secret. We can produce about 4 to 5. We can collect about 400 to 500,000 eggs in about 45 minutes using 3 high school workers. And we perfected this technology, and we actually we do hormonally sex reverse our fish. And this is a method that was developed by the Peace Corps, actually, as a means to feed people. There was the tropical fish industry back in the 50s, 60s, 70s. They realized that if they masculinize fish, then home aquarists can't steal their genetics, right? Because all fish are male. And the Peace Corps said, well, this is a tool that could be used in see if you don't actually masculinize tilapia, they reproduce uncontrollably. If they reproduce uncontrollably, what happens is that they die in these extensive pond environments in the developing world. And so this tool was used there as a way of increasing survival, increasing uniformity, and increasing the abundance of food that is produced through this aquaculture method. We have since developed, we don't use it now, but we've developed a method to produce majority male fish without any hormones. And so we're excited about the implementation of that. And we would not, when we do get into large scale commercial production, which is still our goal, we intend on doing that. Now, we do plan on also getting into aquaponics as well in the not too distant future. In fact, we hope that this year will be the first year that we actually do that commercially. And we're very excited about that expansion because we think there's a huge opportunity. As I mentioned, 53% of the world's fish are grown on farms now, 80% by 2050 or more. Each of you are, I'm 52 years old now. I got excited about aquaculture when I was 8, really started to take form in my 20s. You are literally at the perfect place on the curve with respect to the impact of the type of aquaculture that we're going to have to move into the future with. Aquaculture, one of my closest colleagues built the largest tilapia farm on the planet in the São Francisco Valley of Brazil. It was a 120 million pound operation, if you can imagine that. They diverted much of a river through 1,000 Idaho concrete style raceways, and they grow tilapia there. But those types of locations, they're just gone. They're gone. They don't exist anymore. And there's a macro trend where food is going to be grown closer and closer to the marketplace. And there's the technologies that we use, recirculating aquaculture systems, why historically they've had difficulty competing with those producers that simply grow in outdoor ponds or less expensive systems. That's changing now. In fact, I would say that the majority of investment made in large-scale commercial aquaculture now is into businesses that are utilizing recirculating aquaculture systems. This is a fairly new development in the last couple of years. In salmon farming, they've actually reached capex parity. That is where the cost of of getting into business and the cost of production in this case. I meant capex parity. I meant production cost parity has been achieved for salmon. Now they're kind of in a unique case because they have very high license costs. But in other words, the cost of growing a salmon on a farm on land is the same as it is in a net pen now. And so that eventually will be, we will approach that, I think, with tilapia. The advantage of aquaponics is that, and this is something when I talked about how do we neutralize the advantage that a Latin American producer would have, well, geothermal was that answer. How do you access markets that would-be competitors have no access to? Okay, so the U.S. market for tilapias, as far as the people that we sell fingerlings to that go on to produce those, sell into live markets. There's no way you can get a live fish from Latin America up here and sell it in our stores. It's impossible. It's a captive niche market. It's small, but it's lucrative. So aquaponics really is very similar to that. There's no very little limited potential for foreign competition in that case. And so it's a leg up for domestic producers like us and like some of you maybe someday. And I just Charlie, if there's anything you'd like me to speak to before we get into the question and answer, this would be a good time to make that suggestion. We could kind of have more of an open dialogue.
Yeah, I think in the past presentations, we've seen some questions about your marketing strategy. Maybe you could project what is the future and why, after all this time, are you maybe considering aquaponics? And to me, aquaponics, it really jumps into that nutrient recycling and reusing that waste for the tilapia. So what currently is done with the waste from a big farm like you have? Understanding some of it is contaminated with the methyl testosterone, which if students, you don't know that yet, we'll be talking about that more. But are you doing anything yet? And why aquaponics? Where do you see that going?
I think aquaponics is the future, actually. So we've seen in the Netherlands, for instance, much of almost entirely their vegetable production is under controlled environment conditions. And as in the salmon example I gave, you're going to see increasing with water shortages, with the increasing prevalence of disease issues in like leafy green vegetables. I mean, in the last 11 years, we've seen a major contamination of some sort in vegetables, most of those in lettuce, every single year. These things really impact the mindset of buyers. Ultimately, in aquaculture, you're selling a product. Doesn't matter how well you can grow it, you've got to sell it. To sell it, you've got to compete. You got to have a compelling story, and every food has a story. So I think in aquaponics actually is one of the most elegant stories available. Now, so when we talk about waste, yeah, fish do produce waste, but they produce less waste than almost any other form of animal agriculture. But you have to understand, when you interface with the real world, perception drives marketing decisions, not facts. Okay, so let's take methyl testosterone. So we use methyl testosterone to direct the development of the fish. They hatch in 72 hours from the time they're fertilized. There just isn't enough time to allow their gonads to develop into male or female gonads. That's something that just happens later for a tilapia. And so we administer this. If you take the amount of tests we do feed them, this is an FDA-approved process. And if you take the amount of hormone that we feed those fish over the course of 28 days, which is the treatment period, it's less than the amount of testosterone in a single chicken egg. If you have a testosterone deficient adult male, a male who has to take a dose of testosterone daily, his daily dose is 100 times that amount. Okay. And it dissipates from the tissue of the fish within 36 hours, right? So I've just told you a scientific reason why it has absolutely no potential impact. The market does not care about that. They don't care. They're never going to give you a venue to even listen to that argument. So perception drives all purchasing decisions, and so you have to be above reproach. You have to be above scientific reproach, but you have to be above perceptual approach as well. So we developed this method that is non-hormonal, that we're going to, it's so exacting that it's not something we really want to do now, and our particular customer base is not asking for it, but we would not dare get into adult production without dispensing with the testosterone. We think that the methyl testosterone, even though it would be undeserved, is really the next mercury. It's as mercury in tuna. I think methyl testosterone, it's the whole concept of hormones in food and all this, and it's just fodder for people that would just blow it out of proportion. And so the best thing to do is just to be very intelligent and remove yourself from that argument altogether. Charlie asked about aquaponics. What is the beauty of aquaponics? Like the tilapia carcass itself can be completely utilized. Like tilapia are actually not that meaty. Salmon is about 50% yield. Some species are higher. Tilapia is only a little over 30%, 32, 33%, right? So you have a carcass, though, that's left over. The scales are very valuable. The skin is very valuable. One of my close friends, now deceased, you may have seen a product called Alaska Fish Fertilizer at Home Depot or Lowe's. Alaska Fish Fertilizer was a conception by George Pygott. George Pygott he owned a salmon processing operation in Alaska, and what they do is they take all the offal, which is the waste, the guts, the skin, what's left over once you remove the fillets, and they just throw it off the end of the dock. Of course, they got Dungeness crab up there to gobble all that stuff up, but he thought, what a waste. Well, the enzymes in that fish's gut, you can imagine when you process a fish, it's cold, just like its native conditions in the water. The enzymes, the proteolytic enzymes in that digestive tract don't know the fish is dead. They just don't know. So if you take the viscera of that fish, you acidify it to the pH that it would be in a normal fish stomach, you grind it all up with what's left, and it actually ends up digesting. Those proteolytic enzymes work and digest that product into a protein hydrolysate is what he called it. And he just filter out
solution. Right.
Or nutrient solution, which is honestly, that's where the money is. I mean, if you look at these nutrient solutions on Amazon, I mean, I can't even believe it. It's like $50 a quart. I mean, I'm like, you got to be kidding me. All right, so but that's incredible, and they are. And so you screen out the scales because that is not responsive to proteolytic enzymes, and the bones. But you end up the fish waste itself, the manure, is weed free by definition, right? I mean, it's not like cow manure. I mean, you don't have to sterilize it. You can put it. It's got a fantastic nutrient. It has nutrient ratios. It doesn't have a lot of potassium because that's so soluble, but it's actually quite good in many regards. The scales and the bone you can process into bone meal. The skin is very valuable for a variety of reasons. So you can have a total product utilization there. You have the utilization of their waste stream, converting that in combination with water and sunlight into aquaponic plants. And the manure, like I said, is very saleable, easily dryable. That's one of the things we would do here with our hot water is just dry out the manure and sell it as a product like that. So literally everything is there would be no waste for us. And so, every food has a story. And so you want a story that's very, very compelling. And aquaponics is a pretty easy sell. Another advantage of aquaponics wouldn't be necessarily in our case, but the power of local. Organic was kind of the buzzword back in the 90s and from 2000 to probably 2015. Organic was the thing, right? You get about a 15% valuation bump in most retail outlets if you could consider something organic. Local is kind of the new organic. There's something plays with the psyche of buyers that really value. So yeah, local is very, very important. And so the operation up there in Santa Fe, that's a case in point. They have a real advantage, not only because of logistics, nearness to market, but they've got that local label, which can be the difference between you and another competitor.
I think Damon's probably referring to Desert Verde.
Yep.
Just a reminder to you all that Andrew and I both get our fish from Damon. Most people who are serious fish farmers get their fish from Damon because of the track record, because of this disease resistance and the growth rates. He didn't even talk about low temperature tolerance, or maybe he did, but for a lot of reasons. And as a person like Damon's getting into aquaponics, I want to remind you all that what I often say is that aquaponics belongs in the hands of the fish farmer. We know what we're doing with our fish culture. To bring in a horticulturist into aquaponics is often very difficult. To try to train them to get into industrial RAS systems, that's the challenge. Damon already has that experience, and as you can tell, he's very in tune with nutrients and plant production. So I think that'll be a success. We have a pool of students that could maybe help you in the future. You all keep in touch with Damon. He visits Santa Fe. And what I'm going to do is stop recording, and we'll just take a few minutes to talk to each other. So if you're not one of my students, you're not going to participate in Q&A, but everybody, Americulture.com, I believe. Is that right, Damon?
Yep. Yes.
Great. They're responsive. You talk to them about minimum numbers. I know a lot of you want 15 fish or 30 fish or 500 fish. Often it's 3,000 fish minimum. So you have to reach out to the company and have that discussion. All right, so let me hit stop recording.
And my
Thanks.
parents are up in Santa Fe, so I make periodic trips up there, and so that's the free shipping part.
There we
Just
go.
got
I'm going to wait till after we record, stop recording. All right, let me stop recording real quick. And stop.